December 21st, 1945. A phone rang inside Dwight D. Eisenhower's office in Washington. The voice on the other end delivered the news quietly but decisively. George S. Patton was dead. For 3 long years, Eisenhower had walked a razor's edge. Publicly, he disciplined his most controversial general. Privately, he relied on him to win battles no one else could. He defended Patton to politicians, apologized for him to allies, and restrained him whenever his aggression threatened to ignite diplomatic chaos. Now Patton was gone. And for the first time since the war began, Eisenhower no longer had to choose his words carefully. What he said in the weeks and months that followed revealed a truth he had buried beneath layers of political necessity. Patton wasn't just a good general, he was irreplaceable. Losing him felt like losing the war's most powerful weapon. If you want to hear what Eisenhower truly believed when diplomacy was no longer required, subscribe now. But before there was a supreme commander and a subordinate general, there were 2 young officers who understood each other instinctively. Camp Meade, 1919. Eisenhower and Patton were both captains in the newly formed Tank Corps. They spent endless hours dismantling engines, arguing tactics, and imagining how mechanized warfare would transform combat forever. Patton was the aristocrat, old family money, unshakable confidence, already a combat veteran from Mexico and France. Eisenhower was the Kansas farm boy who had missed combat in World War I and was still searching for his moment to prove himself. Yet they shared a vision. Tanks weren't meant to crawl behind infantry, they were meant to lead, fast, mobile, devastating when unleashed properly. The Army disagreed. Their ideas were dismissed. Their careers were threatened. They were warned to stop pushing these theories. Patton, protected by wealth and status, could afford defiance. Eisenhower, who depended on his paycheck, learned an early lesson. Be careful what you say, even when you're right. 23 years later, those same captains had become the supreme Allied commander in Europe and the most feared American general in uniform. The friendship endured. Everything else had changed. By World War II, Eisenhower no longer stood beside Patton as an equal. Now, he had to manage him. Eisenhower carried the burden of command. He had to channel Patton's aggression, explain his behavior to Roosevelt, Churchill, and Marshall, and constantly decide when to unleash him and when to pull him back. Patton despised it. He believed Eisenhower had become too political, too cautious, too obsessed with diplomacy and coalition harmony. Patton didn't want to negotiate. He wanted to fight. The tension between them simmered throughout the war. 2 men who once dreamed together, now trapped in a hierarchy where one set the vision and the other tested its limits. August 1943, Sicily. Patton commanded the 7th Army during the invasion. While visiting field hospitals, he encountered soldiers suffering from what we now call PTSD, then labeled combat fatigue or shell shock. Patton saw weakness where doctors saw trauma. In 2 separate incidents, he slapped soldiers, humiliated them, and threatened severe punishment. The news spread. Journalists picked it up. Politicians demanded accountability. Public outrage exploded. Eisenhower faced an impossible decision: remove his most effective battlefield commander or defend him and risk a political firestorm. Eisenhower chose neither extreme. He issued a formal reprimand. Patton was ordered to apologize to the soldiers, to the medical staff, and to his entire army. The punishment was public enough to calm critics, but carefully stopped short of ending Patton's career. And there was a reason. Eisenhower was already planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. He didn't just want Patton, he needed him. Sicily had proven it. Patton moved faster, struck harder, and shattered enemy morale more effectively than any other American commander. His army raced across the island while Montgomery advanced methodically. German commanders learned to fear Patton's speed and unpredictability. So, Eisenhower saved Patton's career, but the price was heavy. Eisenhower had to defend the decision to Marshall, to Roosevelt, to the War Department. He promised Patton would be controlled, that it would never happen again, that the military advantage justified the political cost. What Eisenhower could never say publicly was this: he wasn't entirely sure Patton was wrong. In private conversations with his staff, Eisenhower admitted his frustration with soldiers who collapsed under pressure. He didn't excuse Patton's actions, but he understood the mindset. Discipline and endurance mattered in war. Patton's execution was unacceptable, but his instinct wasn't entirely misguided. Eisenhower kept that thought to himself. Publicly, Patton was punished. Privately, he was protected. Spring 1944. D-Day was approaching, and Eisenhower faced a problem that couldn't be solved with firepower alone. He had to convince the Germans that the Allied invasion would land at Calais, not Normandy. The answer was Operation Fortitude, a masterclass in deception, fake armies, fake radio traffic, fake airfields and landing craft. And at the center of it all stood one man, George Patton. The Germans believed Patton was the most dangerous commander the Allies had. They had studied his campaigns in North Africa and Sicily. To them, Patton meant speed, chaos, and destruction. German intelligence tracked his every move obsessively. Eisenhower decided to weaponize that fear. Patton was placed in command of the fictional 1st U.S. Army Group, supposedly preparing to invade Calais. He toured fake bases, inspected non-existent units, and delivered speeches to soldiers who were little more than stage props. Reconnaissance. Planes photographed inflatable tanks and wooden landing craft. The deception worked perfectly, even after D-Day. German forces remained pinned near Calais, convinced Patton's real invasion was still coming. Allied lives were saved because German divisions stayed exactly where Eisenhower wanted them. Patton, however, was furious. He wanted to lead the first wave at Normandy. He wanted combat, not theater. Being used as bait felt humiliating while other generals earned glory on the beaches. Eisenhower couldn't tell him the full truth, that Patton's reputation was doing more damage to the enemy than any single division could. Patton only learned the full scale of fortitude after the war. Even then, the resentment never fully faded, but Eisenhower understood the calculation. He had used Patton's greatest weapon, his reputation, to win before the fighting even began. August 1st, 1944. Patton's Third Army finally went operational in France. What followed stunned everyone. In a single month, the Third Army advanced farther than any comparable force in modern history. Hundreds of towns were liberated. Tens of thousands of German troops were captured or destroyed. The enemy couldn't form defensive lines fast enough before Patton smashed through them. Eisenhower watched with conflicting emotions: pride, because Patton was proving the theories they had discussed back in 1919. Anxiety, because Patton was moving so fast he was outrunning supply lines and disrupting coordination with other Allied forces. Bradley advanced cautiously. Montgomery advanced even slower. Patton simply advanced. He called Eisenhower repeatedly, demanding fuel and ammunition. "Give me the supplies," he insisted, "and I'll be in Berlin in 2 weeks." Eisenhower knew it wasn't that simple. Supplies had to be shared. Political agreements mattered. Soviet occupation zones had already been negotiated. Patton ignored all of it. He saw a collapsing enemy and wanted to finish them before they could recover. And in private moments, Eisenhower sometimes agreed. Privately, Eisenhower admitted to his chief of staff, Bedell Smith, that Patton might be right. that caution and politics were sometimes interfering with military logic. But as Supreme Commander, Eisenhower couldn't think like a single general. He had to think like the alliance. American, British, and Soviet priorities had to be balanced. The war had to be won, and the peace preserved. Eisenhower slowed Patton down, redirected supplies to Montgomery for Operation Market Garden, a decision that would end in failure. Patton was ordered to pause, consolidate, and coordinate. He was furious. Patton believed Eisenhower was squandering the best chance to end the war early. Their relationship, already strained, became openly hostile at times. Then came December 16, 1944. The Germans launched a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes forest. The Battle of the Bulge exploded across the front. American units were overwhelmed. Entire divisions were surrounded. For the first time since D-Day, Allied lines collapsed. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting at Verdun. The mood was grim. Bradley looked shaken. Montgomery spoke cautiously. Other commanders discussed defensive lines and waiting for reinforcements. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George," he asked, "how soon can you attack?" Everyone understood what that meant. Patton's Third Army was engaged far to the south, positioned at a 90-degree angle to the crisis. To respond, he would have to disengage completely, pivot his entire force, and attack through brutal winter conditions. Most commanders would need weeks. Patton reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook. He had already wargamed this exact scenario during the train ride to Verdun. He looked up and said, "December 22nd, 3 divisions, 72 hours." The room fell silent. Bradley was skeptical. Others thought it impossible. Eisenhower didn't hesitate. He knew Patton well enough to know this wasn't bravado. "Make it happen," Eisenhower replied. Patton did. On December 22nd, exactly as promised, 3 divisions of the Third Army smashed into the German southern flank. The attack stopped the offensive cold and turned a looming disaster into an Allied victory. This was the moment. Everything paid off. Every scandal, every apology, every restriction Eisenhower had placed on Patton finally made sense. When everything was falling apart, Eisenhower turned to the one man who could do the impossible, and Patton delivered. Throughout the war, Eisenhower's public comments about Patton were always measured, respectful but restrained. He praised Patton's results without elevating him above other commanders. Favoritism would have fractured the alliance he was holding together. Privately, it was different. In planning meetings, Eisenhower often asked, "What would Patton do?" Not because Patton was always right, but because he thought differently. Where others saw obstacles, Patton saw openings. Where others weighed risks, Patton calculated speed. Eisenhower's diary entries from 1944 and 1945 reveal his frustration. He needed Patton's aggression, yet had to restrain it. He valued Patton's victories, yet constantly apologized for his behavior. He relied on Patton in crisis, but could never admit it publicly. When the war ended, Patton became a liability almost overnight. His comments about former Nazis triggered scandal. His calls to confront the Soviets were politically explosive. The very traits that made him unstoppable in war made him dangerous in peace. Eisenhower had no choice. He removed Patton from command, one of the hardest decisions of his life. Their final conversations were tense and bitter. Patton felt betrayed. Eisenhower felt trapped by responsibility. Then came the car accident. 12 days later, George S. Patton was dead. Only then did Eisenhower's diplomatic mask finally slip. In private letters and conversations, he spoke with unfiltered honesty. He admitted that Patton achieved results through speed, pressure, and sheer force of personality, qualities that couldn't be taught or replaced. Other generals commanded through planning. Patton commanded through will. Eisenhower confessed that restraining Patton had been politically necessary, not militarily, that some decisions to slow him down still haunted him, that perhaps, with more freedom, the war might have ended sooner. Patton thrived in chaos, the exact moments when others hesitated. When decisions had to be instant, Patton was at his best. Managing Patton, Eisenhower said, had been the hardest part of his command, and the most important. Unchecked, Patton would have caused diplomatic disasters. Properly directed, he was unstoppable. In his memoirs, Eisenhower used a rare word to describe him: indispensable. Patton was built for war, for speed, aggression, and relentless pressure. In peace, those same traits became liabilities. Eisenhower became president in 1953 and led America through the early Cold War. Yet even decades later, he still spoke of Patton, of Camp Meade, of impossible choices, of the moment he needed someone who could do the impossible. America lost more than a general on December 21, 1945. It lost a man uniquely suited for chaos. Eisenhower had always known it, but only after Patton was gone could he finally say it.